He never quite fits into either conversation happening around him. When his older coworkers talk about cassette tapes and rotary phones, he nods along, but something about it feels slightly off. When his younger coworkers talk about growing up with a tablet already in their hands, he nods again, and something still feels off. Nobody has ever actually asked him which one he truly is. I started noticing this pattern a few years ago, almost by accident, in conversation after conversation. I kept meeting people born in that narrow window between 1976 and 1985, and nearly every one of them described the exact same quiet confusion. They didn't fully belong to Generation X, and they didn't fully belong to the Millennials either. They belonged to something in between, something that never even had its own name until fairly recently. Something people now call Xennials. At first, this seems like nothing more than a demographic label, a line drawn on some researcher's spreadsheet. But that isn't actually the interesting part of the story. The interesting part is what happens when a person spends their entire childhood in one world and their entire adulthood in a completely different one. Nobody ever hands them a map for that kind of transition. He remembers a home phone bolted permanently to the kitchen wall, its cord stretched halfway across the room for a bit of privacy. He also remembers, only a handful of years later, holding a phone that fit in his pocket and connected him instantly to everyone he had ever known. Nobody warned him how strange that particular shift would eventually come to feel. You may recognize this feeling if you happen to be born in that same decade. Maybe you remember waiting anxiously for a photograph to be developed, never knowing if your eyes were closed until days afterward. Maybe you also remember, not long after, taking 100 photos in a single afternoon and deleting the bad ones instantly. Both of those memories somehow live inside the same person, and that person had to quietly build an identity out of both. What surprised me most was how differently this particular group talks about change compared to almost everyone around them. Older generations often describe technology as something that arrived suddenly and disrupted their settled lives. Younger generations often describe it as something that was simply always there, like electricity or running water in the walls. But he describes it very differently than either of them, almost like a sibling who grew up right beside him, maturing at exactly the same pace he did. That difference creates something psychologists sometimes call a bridge identity, and it explains far more than it first appears to. A person carrying a bridge identity never fully anchors themselves inside either surrounding culture around them. Instead, they develop a strange fluency in translation, constantly moving between two very different emotional languages without ever fully settling into just one. At first, this fluency looks almost like a gift, something worth quietly being proud of. He can talk to his parents about handwritten letters and mean every word sincerely. He can talk to his own children about live streams and mean that just as sincerely without any real effort. Until you notice something else happening quietly underneath that flexibility, something much harder to name out loud. Because being fluent in two different worlds often means never being fully claimed by either one.
Older generations sometimes see him as too casual, too comfortable with screens, too willing to bend rules that once felt permanently fixed in place. Younger generations sometimes see him as too cautious, too attached to old habits, always slightly behind whatever trend just emerged online. He ends up standing quietly in the middle of a room nobody ever built specifically for him. Little by little, that in-between feeling starts shaping nearly everything he does without him even noticing it happening. Watch him closely at a family dinner sometime, and you'll see it immediately. He's usually the one translating between his aging parents and his own kids, softening misunderstandings long before they turn into real conflict. Nobody officially assigned him that role at any point. He simply became the natural translator because he happened to be the only one fluent in both directions at once. His marriage often carries the same quiet pattern, even though almost nobody would describe it that way out loud. He remembers courtship as something built slowly, through phone calls tied to a kitchen wall and letters that took days to arrive. His spouse, sometimes only a few years younger, remembers courtship as something built through instant messages and constant, immediate access to each other. He learned to hold both versions of intimacy inside the same relationship, patiently, without ever fully naming the difference between them. That quiet patience looks like maturity from the outside, and most of the time it genuinely is. But it also means he rarely asks which version of closeness he actually prefers for himself. I began seeing this same pattern repeating itself inside workplaces too, almost everywhere I looked. He often becomes the unofficial bridge between senior leadership and newer, younger employees just starting out. His managers value this skill deeply, without ever quite naming what the effort actually costs him personally. Constant translation between two different worlds is exhausting, even when absolutely nobody around him notices that effort. Eventually, this translating role stops feeling like a skill and starts feeling like an entire identity instead. He begins defining himself almost entirely by his usefulness as a connector between people. And that's where everything slowly begins changing, because a person who spends their life connecting others rarely stops long enough to ask what actually connects them to themselves. Maybe you've noticed something similar happening quietly in your own life, that habit of adapting so smoothly that people forget you have needs of your own too. Xennials developed this particular skill early, almost as a survival response to growing up during a genuinely unstable stretch of recent history. They watched serious economic recessions arrive twice before they had even turned 40 years old. They watched their childhood technology become completely obsolete within a single decade. They learned very early on that stability was something you had to build yourself. That early lesson explains a habit I kept noticing again and again, one that seemed small until I finally understood exactly where it came from. He rarely complains out loud about instability, even when it clearly and deeply affects him. Ask him directly about job security, and he'll shrug in a way that looks casual but honestly isn't. Ask him about long-term plans, and flexibility comes up in conversation long before certainty ever does. That reaction isn't indifference at all, even though it often looks that way from the outside. It's a coping mechanism, quietly built from years of repeated exposure to unpredictable change. Underneath that coping mechanism sits something even quieter, something he almost never says out loud to anyone. It's a belief, formed early and constantly reinforced, that adaptability matters more than authenticity ever could.
If he can bend himself to fit almost any situation, he assumes he'll always eventually find a place to stand. But that particular belief carries a hidden cost that took him years to fully notice. Because if your entire sense of value comes from adapting to others, you eventually lose track of who you'd actually be without all that adapting. He can tell you exactly how to navigate a room full of wildly different generations. Ask him what he personally needs from that very same room, though, and the answer comes much slower, sometimes not at all. You might recognize this pattern clearly if you've spent years being the reliable one, the flexible one everyone assumes will figure things out. From the outside, it genuinely looks like strength, maybe even admirable strength. From the inside, though, it often feels like slowly disappearing, one small accommodation at a time. What surprised me even more once I started paying much closer attention was how this generation quietly processes nostalgia. It isn't simple sentimentality, and it never really was. It's something closer to grief, quiet and mostly kept private, even from the people closest to him. He doesn't just miss the analog world he happened to grow up inside. He misses the earlier version of himself, the one that existed before constant translation became his everyday job. That grief rarely gets expressed directly, in words anyone else would recognize as grief. Instead, it shows up sideways, in the way he talks about certain songs, certain smells, certain textures from childhood that simply don't exist anymore. Watch his face carefully when an old commercial jingle plays unexpectedly on the radio. For just a few seconds, something genuine surfaces that his usual adult composure normally keeps carefully hidden. Without ever quite realizing it, this generation built an entire emotional vocabulary around the idea of transition itself. They talk about being the last generation to remember life before the internet so often that it's become a kind of shorthand identity for them. But underneath that familiar phrase sits something more vulnerable than simple nostalgia. It's a quiet insistence on being remembered as something distinct, something with its own real name. It's a resistance to being folded silently into whatever larger generation happens to feel more culturally visible right now. That deep need to be distinctly seen explains a lot about how he reacts whenever someone mislabels him publicly. Call him a millennial, and something small visibly tightens in his expression for just a moment. Call him Generation X instead, and the very same thing happens again, just slightly differently this time. It was never really about the specific label itself. It's about spending an entire life feeling slightly unclaimed by everyone, and finally wanting one thing that belongs specifically and only to him. Notice how he handles a simple phone call, too, something almost nobody would think twice about. He still prefers calling his doctor's office directly to schedule an appointment, even though an app could technically do it faster. Not because he distrusts the app, but because some quiet part of him still associates real conversation with real care. His own children will likely never understand that instinct, and honestly, he doesn't fully expect them to. It's a small, almost invisible habit, but it quietly reveals how much of his inner world still runs on two separate operating systems at once. Think about a retirement party some ex-Xennial will attend decades from now, standing between colleagues who remember paper filing cabinets and colleagues who've never once used one. He'll be the one quietly explaining both worlds to each other again, just like always, right up until the very end. That single detail explains far more about his whole life than almost anything else could. Neighborhoods reveal this same quiet split too, if you know where to look for it.
He remembers knocking on a neighbor's door just to ask if their kid could come outside and play. His own kids, meanwhile, mostly coordinate playdates through a group chat scheduled days in advance. He isn't nostalgic about this difference in any bitter way, and he genuinely tries not to judge either version too harshly. Still, something in him quietly wonders whether spontaneous, unscheduled connection is a skill his children will ever fully get to practice. That small worry rarely gets spoken aloud, but it sits there anyway, another quiet thread in the same larger pattern. I think that's actually the deepest layer underneath everything else I noticed while looking into all of this. Beneath the adaptability, beneath the quiet translating, beneath the careful and private nostalgia, there's a simple, unmet need to be fully understood rather than just approximately categorized by others. He has spent decades standing close enough to two entirely different worlds without ever fully belonging inside either one. And once you see that underlying need clearly, every earlier behavior suddenly starts making sense together instead of separately. The flexibility at work, the quiet grief for a childhood texture that no longer really exists anywhere, the instinctive discomfort with either generational label people try placing on him, the tendency to become everyone's translator while rarely translating his own feelings for himself, even in private. None of these were ever separate traits floating around independently. They're all branches growing from the exact same root experience, the experience of living permanently somewhere in between two things. Maybe you've been quietly watching someone like him for years without ever realizing what was actually happening underneath the surface. Maybe you simply assumed he was easygoing, naturally adaptable, just generally good at getting along with almost anyone he met. Maybe that easiness was actually the visible edge of something much heavier underneath, something he learned to carry quietly because nobody ever built proper language for his particular experience. Or maybe, and this happens more often than people expect, you actually are him. Maybe you've spent years quietly being the bridge, the translator, the flexible one who never quite gets to name their own position out loud. Maybe you've wondered occasionally, mostly in private moments late at night, whether belonging fully to something is even still possible for someone like you. There's no simple resolution I can honestly offer you here, and pretending otherwise wouldn't be fair to you. What I can say is that understanding exactly where this pattern comes from tends to loosen its grip a little. Once he recognizes that his adaptability was a genuine response to real instability rather than some personal flaw, something inside him tends to soften noticeably. Once he understands his nostalgia isn't weakness, but unprocessed grief for a childhood that changed unusually fast, something shifts. He starts letting himself actually feel it instead of quietly setting it aside again. If today's conversation helped explain why some people seem to exist comfortably between two worlds, that's worth sitting with for a moment. Why they quietly long for one world they can fully claim as their own. That's exactly where we'll pick up next time, and the next conversation naturally continues from exactly here. It explores what happens when that same in-between feeling extends far beyond generations entirely, into the way people build relationships, careers, and even their private sense of home. Watching it should feel like continuing this exact same thread, not starting somewhere completely new. Thank you sincerely for spending this time thinking alongside me today. If this helped you understand yourself or someone you genuinely care about a little more clearly, consider giving it a like before you go. And here's one meaningful question I'd genuinely love for you to sit with afterward. Which world did you actually grow up believing in? The one before that big shift, or the one that arrived right after it? If you enjoy this kind of quiet, honest psychology conversation, consider subscribing and turn on notifications if you'd like to keep thinking through questions like this one together. I'll see you again in the next one.